Yep. Okay. Chapter 20. I'm going to try to push through and read all of it because I think it's semi-bearable, but if I grow exhausted, I may just cut it at like half, but I'll see. Okay, so starting at 421. Had to clear my throat. Hey, this quote that Lincoln said, he said it on my birthday. I mean, I wasn't alive in 1861, but he said it on May 7th. That's my birthday. Okay. Abraham Lincoln solemnly took the presidential oath of office on March 4th, 1861, after having slipped into Washington that night, partially disguised to thwart assassins. He thus became president not of the United States of America, but of the disunited States of America. 7 had already departed, 8 more teetered on the edge. The girders of the unfinished Capitol dome loomed nakedly in the background, as if to symbolize the imperfect state of the Union. Before the nation was restored and the slaves freed at last, the American people would endure 4 years of anguish and bloodshed, and Lincoln would face torturous trials of leadership such as have been visited upon few presidents. The menace of secession. Lincoln's inaugural address was firm yet conciliatory. There would be no conflict unless the South provoked it. Secession, the president declared, was wholly impractical because, physically speaking, we cannot separate. Here Lincoln put his finger on a profound geographical truth. The North and South were conjoined twins, bound inseparably together. If they had been divided by the Pyrenees or the Pyrenees or the Danube River, a sectional divorce might have been more feasible, but the Appalachian Mountains and the mighty Mississippi River both ran the wrong way. Uncontested secession would create new controversies. What share of the national debt should the South be forced to take with it? What portion of the jointly held federal territories, if any, should the Confederate States be allotted, areas so largely won with Southern blood? How would the fugitive slave issue be resolved? The Underground Railroad would certainly redouble its activity, and it would have to transport its passengers only across the Ohio River, not all the way to Canada. Was it conceivable that all such problems could have been solved without ugly armed clashes? A United States had hitherto been the paramount republic in the Western Hemisphere. If this powerful democracy should break into 2 hostile parts, the European nations would be delighted. They could gleefully transplant to America their ancient concept of balance of power. Playing the no less ancient game of divide and conquer, they could incite one snarling fragment of the disunited states against the other. The colonies of the European powers in the New World, notably those of Britain, would thus be made safer against the rapacious Yankees, and the European imperialists, with no unified republic to stand across their path, could more easily defy the Monroe Doctrine and seize territory in the Americas. South Carolina assails Fort Sumter. The issue of the divided Union came to a head over the matter of federal forts in the South. As the seceding states left, they seized the United States arsenals, mints, and other republic properties within their borders. When Lincoln took office, the only 2 significant forts in the South were still flew the Stars and Stripes. The more important of the pair was square-walled Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, with fewer than 100 men. Ominously, the choices presented to Lincoln by Fort Sumter were all bad. This stronghold had provisions that would only last a few weeks until the middle of April 1861. If no supplies were forthcoming, its commander would have to surrender without firing a shot. Lincoln, quite understandably, did not feel that such a weak-kneed course squared with his obligation to protect federal property. But if he sent reinforcements, the South Carolinians would undoubtedly fight back. They could not tolerate a federal fort blocking the mouth of their most important Atlantic seaport. After agonizing indecision, Lincoln adopted a middle-of-the-road solution. He notified the South Carolinians that an expedition would be sent to provision the garrison, not to reinforce it. He promised no effort to throw in men, arms, and ammunition, but to Southern eyes, provision still spelled reinforcement. A Union naval force was next started on its way to Fort Sumter, a move that the South regarded as an act of aggression. On April 12, 1861, the cannon of the Carolinians opened fire on the fort, while the crowds in Charleston applauded and waved handkerchiefs. After a 34-hour bombardment which took no lives, the dazed garrison surrendered. The shelling of the fort electrified the North, which at once responded with cries of "Remember Fort Sumter" and "Save the Union." Hitherto, countless Northerners had been saying that if the Southern states wanted to go, they should not be pinned to the rest of the nation with bayonets. "Wayward sisters, depart in peace," was a common sentiment, expressed even by the commander of the army, war hero General Winfield Scott, now so feeble at 75 that he had to be boosted onto his horse. But the assault on Fort Sumter provoked the North to a fighting pitch. The fort was lost, but the Union was saved. Lincoln had turned a tactical defeat into a calculated victory. Southerners had wantonly fired upon the glorious Stars and Stripes, and honor demanded an armed response. Lincoln promptly, April 15th, issued a call to the states for 75,000 militiamen, and volunteers sprang to the colors in such enthusiastic numbers that many were turned away, a mistake that was not often repeated. On April 19th and 27th, the president proclaimed a leaky blockade of southern seaports. The call for troops, in turn, aroused the South much as the attack on Fort Sumter had aroused the North. Lincoln was now waging war, from the Southern view, an aggressive war, on the Confederacy. Virginia, Arkansas, and Tennessee, all of which had earlier voted down secession, reluctantly joined their embattled sister states, as did North Carolina. Thus, the 7 states became 11, as the submissionists and Union shriekers were overcome. Richmond, Virginia, replaced Montgomery, Alabama as the Confederate capital, too near Washington for strategic comfort on either side. Oops. Brothers' blood and border blood. The only slave states left were the crucial border states. This group consisted of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. If the North had fired the first shot, some or all of these doubtful states probably would have seceded, and the South might well have succeeded. The border groups actually contained a white population more than half of that of the entire Confederacy. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri would almost double the manufacturing capacity of the South and increase by nearly half its supply of horses and mules. The strategic prize of the Ohio River flowed along the northern border of Kentucky and West Virginia, the Mountain White area that somewhat illegally tore itself from the side of Virginia to become a free state in mid-1861. 2 of the Ohio River's navigable tributaries, the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, penetrated deep into the heart of Dixie, where much of the Confederacy's grain, gunpowder, and iron was produced. Small wonder that Lincoln reportedly said he hoped to have God on his side, but he had to have Kentucky. In dealing with the border states, President Lincoln did not rely solely on moral suasion, but successfully used methods of dubious legality. In Maryland, he declared martial law where he needed and sent in troops, because this state threatened to cut off Washington from the north. Lincoln also deployed Union soldiers in western Virginia and notably in Missouri, where they fought beside Unionists in a local civil war within the larger Civil War. Any official statement of the North's war aims was profoundly influenced by the teetering border states. At the very outset, Lincoln was obligated to declare publicly that he was not fighting to free the blacks. An anti-slavery declaration would no doubt have driven the border states into the welcoming arms of the South. An anti-slavery war was also extremely unpopular in the so-called butternut region of southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. That area had been settled largely by Southerners who carried their racial prejudices with them when they had crossed the Ohio River. It was to be a hotbed of pro-Southern sentiment through the war. Sensitive to this delicate political calculus, Lincoln insisted repeatedly, even though undercutting his moral high ground, that his paramount purpose was to save the Union at all costs. Thus, the war began not as one between slave soil and free soil, but one for the Union, with slaveholders on both sides and many pro-slavery sympathizers in the North. Slavery also colored the character of the war in the West. In Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, most of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, sided with the Confederacy. Some of these Indians, notably the Cherokees, owned slaves and thus felt themselves to be making common cause with the slave-owning South. To secure their loyalty, the Confederate government agreed to take over federal payments to the tribes and invited the Native Americans to send delegates to the Confederate Congress. In return, the tribes supplied troops to the Confederate Army. Meanwhile, a rival faction of the Cherokees and most of the Plains Indians sided with the Union, only to be rewarded after the war with a relentless military campaign to herd them onto reservations or into oblivion. Unhappily, the conflict between Billy Yank and Johnny Reb was a brothers' war. There were many northern volunteers from the southern states and many southern volunteers from the northern states. The mountain whites of the South sent north some 50,000 men, and the loyal slave states contributed some 300,000 soldiers to the Union. In many a family of the border states, one brother rode north to fight with the blue, another south to fight with the gray. Senator Crittenden of Kentucky, who had fathered the abortive Crittenden Compromise, also had fathered 2 sons. One became a general in the Union Army, the other a general in the Confederate Army. Lincoln's own Kentucky-born wife had 4 brothers who fought for the Confederacy. The balance of forces. When war broke out, the South seemed to have great advantages. The Confederacy could fight defensively behind the interior lines. The North had to invade the vast territory of the Confederacy, conquer it, and drag it bodily back into the Union. In fact, the South did not have to win the war in order to win its independence. If it merely fought the invaders to a draw and stood firm, Confederate independence would be won. Fighting on their own soil for self-determination and preservation of their way of life, Southerners at first enjoyed an advantage in morale as well. Militarily, the South, from the opening volleys of the war, had the most talented officers. Most conspicuous among a dozen or so first-rate commanders was gray-haired General Robert E. Lee, whose knightly and bearing chivalric sense of sense of honor embodied the Southern ideal. Lincoln had unofficially offered him to command of the Northern armies, but when Virginia seceded, Lee felt honor-bound to go with his native state. Lee's chief lieutenant for much of the war was black-bearded Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, a gifted tactical theorist and a master of speed and deception. Besides their brilliant leaders, ordinary Southerners were also bred to fight. Accustomed to managing horses and bearing arms from boyhood, they made excellent cavalrymen and foot soldiers. Their high-pitched rebel yell, "Yeah!" was designed to strike terror into the hearts of flush-chinned Yankee recruits. "There's nothing like it on this side of the infernal region," one northern soldier declared. "The peculiar corkscrew sensation that it sends down your backbone can never be told. You have to feel it." As one immense farm, the South seemed to be handicapped by the scarcity of the factories. Yet by seizing federal weapons, running Union blockades, and developing their own ironworks, Southerners managed to obtain sufficient weaponry. Yankee ingenuity was not confined to Yankees. Nevertheless, as the war dragged on, grave shortages of shoes, uniforms, and blankets disabled the South. Even with immense stores of food on Southern farms, civilians and soldiers often went hungry because of supply problems. "Forward, men, they have cheese in their haversacks," cried one Southern officer as he attacked the Yankees. Much of the hunger was caused by a breakdown of the South's rickety transportation system, especially where the railroad tracks were cut or destroyed by the Yankee invaders. The economy was the greatest Southern weakness. It was the North's greatest strength. The North was not only a huge farm, but a sprawling factory as well. The Yankees boasted about 3/4 of the nation's wealth, including 3/4 of the 30,000 miles of railroads. The North also controlled the sea. With its vastly superior navy, it established a blockade that, though a sieve at first, soon choked off Southern supplies and eventually shattered Southern morale. Its sea power also enabled the North to exchange huge quantities of grain for munitions and supplies from Europe, thus adding the output from factories of Europe to its own. The Union also enjoyed a much larger reserve of manpower. The loyal states had a population of some 22 million. The seceding states had 9 million people, including about 3.5 million slaves. Adding to the North's overwhelming supply of soldiery were ever more immigrants from Europe, who continued to pour into the North even during the war. Over 800,000 newcomers had arrived between 1861 and 1865, most of them British, Irish, and German. Large numbers of them were induced to enlist in the Union Army. Altogether, about 1/5 of the Union forces were foreign-born, and in some units military commands were given in 4 different languages. Whether immigrant or native, ordinary Northern boys were much less prepared than their Southern counterparts for military life. Yet the Northern clodhoppers and shopkeepers eventually adjusted themselves to soldiering and became known for their discipline and determination. The North was much less fortunate in its higher commanders. Lincoln was forced to use a costly trial-and-error method to sort out effective leaders from the many incompetent political officers, until he finally uncovered a general, Ulysses Simpson Grant, who was determined to slog his way to victory at whatever cost in life and limb. In the long run, as the Northern strengths were brought to bear, they outweighed those of the South. But when the war began, the chances for Southern independence were unusually favorable, certainly better than the prospects for success of the 13 colonies in 1776. The turn of a few events could easily have produced a different outcome. The might-haves-beens are fascinating. If the border states had seceded, if the uncertain states of the upper Mississippi Valley had turned against the Union, if a wave of Northern defeatism had demanded an armistice, and if Britain and or France had broken the Union's naval blockade of Southern ports, the South might well have won. All of these possibilities almost became realities, but none of them actually occurred, and lacking their impetus, the South could not hope to win. Dethroning King Cotton. Successful revolutions, including the American Revolution of 1776, have generally succeeded because of foreign intervention. The South counted on it, did not get it, and lost. All of the Confederacy's potential assets, none counted more weightily than the prospect of foreign intervention. Europe's ruling classes were openly sympathetic to the Confederate cause. They had long abhorred the incendiary example of the American democratic experiment, and they cherished a kind of fellow feeling for the South's semi-feudal aristocratic social order. In contrast, the masses of the working people in Britain and to some extent in France were pulling and praying for the North. Many of them had read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they sensed that the war, though at the outset officially fought only over the question of union, might extinguish slavery if the North emerged victorious. The common folk of Britain could not yet cast the ballot, but they could cast the brick. Their certain hostility to any official intervention on behalf of the South evidently had a sobering effect on the British government. Thus, the dead hands of Uncle Tom helped Uncle Sam by restraining the British and French ironclads from piercing the Union blockade. Yet the fact remained that British textile mills depended on the American South for 75% of their cotton supplies. Wouldn't silent looms force London to speak? Humanitarian sympathies aside, Southerners counted on hard economic need to bring Britain to their aid. Why did King Cotton fail them? He failed in part because he had been so lavishly productive in the immediate pre-war years of 1857 to 1860. Enormous exports of cotton in those years had piled up surpluses in British warehouses. When the shooting started in 1861, British manufacturers had on hand a hefty oversupply of fiber. The real pinch did not come until about a year and a half later, when thousands of hungry operatives were thrown out of work. But by this time, Lincoln had announced his slave emancipation policy, and the wage slaves of Britain were not going to demand a war to defend the slave owners of the South. The direst effects of the cotton famine in Britain were relieved in several ways. Hunger among unemployed workers was partially eased when certain kind-hearted Americans sent over several cargoes of foodstuffs. As Union armies penetrated the South, they captured or bought considerable supplies of cotton and shipped them to Britain. The Confederates also ran a limited quantity through blockade. In addition, the cotton growers of Egypt and India, responding to high prices, increased their output and captured a share of the world cotton market that they held on to well after the war's conclusion. Finally, booming war industries in England, which supplied both the North and the South, relieved unemployment. King Wheat and King Corn, the monarchs of northern agriculture, proved to be more potentates than King Cotton. During these war years, the North, blessed with ideal weather, produced bountiful crops of grain and harvested them with McCormick's mechanical reaper. In the same period, the British suffered a series of bad harvests. They were forced to import huge quantities of grain from America, which happened to have the cheapest and most abundant supply. If Britain had broken the blockade to gain cotton, they would have provoked the North to the war and would have lost this precious granary. Unemployment for some seemed better than hunger for all. Hence, one Yankee journal could exult. Wave the stars and stripes high over us, let every freeman sing, old King Cotton's dead and buried, brave young Corn is king. The decisiveness of diplomacy. America's diplomatic front has seldom been so critical as during the Civil War. The South never wholly abandoned its dream of foreign intervention, and Europe's rulers schemed to take advantage of America's distress. The first major crisis with Britain came over the Trent affair, late in 1861. A Union warship cruising on the high seas north of Cuba stopped a British mail steamer, the Trent, and forcibly removed two Confederate diplomats bound for Europe. Britons were outraged. Upstart Yankees could not so boldly offend the mistress of the seas. War preparations buzzed, and red-coated troops embarked for Canada with bands blaring, "I wish I was in Dixie." The London Foreign Office prepared an ultimatum demanding surrender of the prisoners and an apology. But luckily, slow communications gave passions on both sides a chance to cool. Lincoln came to see the Trent prisoners as white elephants and reluctantly released them. "One war at a time," he reportedly said. Another major crisis in Anglo-American relations arose of the unneutral building in Britain of Confederate commerce raiders, notably the Alabama. These vessels were not warships within the meaning of loopholed British law because they left their shipyards unarmed and picked up their guns elsewhere. The Alabama escaped in 1862 to the Portuguese Azores, and there took on weapons and a crew from two British ships that followed it. Although flying the Confederate flag and officered by Confederates, it was manned by Britons and never entered a Confederate port. Britain was thus the chief naval base of the Confederacy. The Alabama lighted the skies from Europe to the Far East with the burning of hulks of Yankee merchantmen. All told, this British pirate captured over 60 vessels. Competing British shippers were delighted, while an angered North had to divert naval strength from its blockade for wild goose chases. The barnacled Alabama finally accepted a challenge from a stronger Union cruiser off the coast of France in 1864 and was quickly destroyed. The Alabama was beneath the waves, but the issue of British-built Confederate raiders stayed afloat. Under prodding by the American minister Charles Francis Adams, the British gradually perceived that allowing such ships to be built was a dangerous precedent that might someday be used against them. In 1863, London openly violated its own leaky laws and seized another raider being built for the South. But despite greater official efforts by Britain to remain truly neutral, Confederate commerce destroyers, chiefly British-built, captured more than 250 Yankee ships, severely crippling the American merchant marine, which never fully recovered. Glowering Northerners looked farther north and talked openly of securing revenge by grabbing Canada when the war was over. Foreign flare-ups. A final Anglo-American crisis was touched off in 1863 by the Laird Rams, two Confederate warships being constructed in the shipyard of John Laird and Sons in Great Britain. Designed to destroy the wooden ships of the Union Navy with their iron rams and large-caliber guns, they were far more dangerous than the swift but lightly armed Alabama. If delivered to the South, they probably would have sunk the blockading squadrons and then brought northern cities under their fire. In retaliation, the North doubtless would have invaded Canada, and a full-dress war with Britain would have erupted. But Minister Adams took a hard line, warning that this is war if the rams were released. At the last minute, the London government relented and bought the two ships for the Royal Navy. Everyone seemed satisfied, except the disappointed Confederates. Britain also eventually repented its sorry role in the Alabama business. It agreed in 1871 to submit the Alabama dispute to arbitration, and in 1872 paid American claimants $15.5 million for damages caused by wartime commerce raiders. American rancor was also directed at Canada, where, despite the vigilance of British authorities, Southern agents plotted to burn northern cities. One Confederate raid into Vermont left 3 banks plundered and 1 American citizen dead. Hatred of England burned especially fiercely among Irish Americans, and they unleashed their fury on Canada. They raised several tiny armies of a few hundred green-shirted men and launched invasions of Canada, notably in 1866 and 1870. And the Canadians condemned the Washington government for permitting such violations of neutrality, but the administration was hampered by the presence of so many Irish American voters. As fate would have it, the 2 great nations emerged from the fiery furnace of the American Civil War. One was a reunited United States, and the other was a united Canada. The British Parliament established the Dominion of Canada in 1867. It was partly designed to bolster the Canadians, both politically and spiritually, against the possible vengeance of the United States. Emperor Napoleon III of France, taking advantage of America's preoccupation with its own internal problems, dispatched a French army to occupy Mexico City in 1863. The following year, he installed on the ruins of the crushed republic his puppet, Austrian Archduke Maximilian, as the Emperor of Mexico. Both sending the army and enthroning Maximilian were flagrant violations of the Monroe Doctrine. Napoleon was gambling that the Union would collapse, and thus America would be too weak to enforce its hands-off policy in the Western Hemisphere. The North, as long as it was convulsed by the war, pursued a walk-on-eggs policy toward France. The Washington government gave aid to the resistance movement headed by Mexico's beloved national hero and the first full-blooded Indian president of Mexico, Benito Juarez. But when the shooting stopped in 1865, Secretary of State Seward, speaking with the authority of nearly a million war-tempered bayonets, prepared to march south. Napoleon realized that his costly gamble was doomed. He reluctantly took French leave of his ill-starred puppet in 1867, and Maximilian soon crumbled ingloriously before a Mexican firing squad. President Davis versus President Lincoln. The Confederate government, like King Cotton, harbored fatal weaknesses. Its constitution, borrowing liberally from that of the Union, contained one deadly defect. Created by secession, it could not logically deny future secession to its constituent states. President Davis, while making his bow to the states' rights, had in view a well-knit central government, but determined states' rights supporters fought him bitterly to the end. The Richmond regime encountered difficulty even in persuading certain states' troops to serve outside their own borders. The governor of Georgia, a belligerent states' righter at times, seemed ready to secede from the secession and fight both sides. States' rights were no less damaging to the Confederacy than Yankee firepower. Sharp-featured Jefferson Davis, tense, humorless, legalistic, and stubborn, was repeatedly in hot water. Although an eloquent orator and an able administrator, he at no time enjoyed a real personal popularity and was often at loggerheads with his Congress. At times, there was serious talk of impeachment. Davis was somewhat imperious and inclined to defy rather than lead public opinion. Suffering acutely from neuralgia and other nervous disorders, including a tic, he overworked himself with the details of both civil government and military operations. No one could doubt his courage, sincerity, integrity, and devotion to the South, but the task proved beyond his powers. It was probably beyond the powers of any mere mortal. Lincoln also had his troubles, but on the whole they were less prostrating. The North enjoyed the prestige of a long-established government, financially stable and fully recognized both at home and abroad. Lincoln, the inexperienced prairie politician, proved superior to the more experienced but less flexible Davis. Able to relax with droll stories at critical times, Old Abe grew as the war dragged on. Tactful, quiet, patient, yet firm, he developed a genius for interpreting and leading a fickle public opinion. Holding aloft the banner of Union with inspiring utterances, he demonstrated charitableness toward the South and forbearance toward backbiting colleagues. Did Secretary of War Edwin Stanton say I was a damned fool? He reportedly replied to a talebearer. Then I dare say I must be one, for Stanton is generally right, and he always says what he means. Limitations on wartime liberties. Honest Abe Lincoln, when inaugurated, laid his hand on the Bible and swore a solemn oath to uphold the Constitution. Then, feeling driven by necessity, he proceeded to tear a few holes in that hallowed document. He understandably concluded that if he did not do so, and patched the parchment later, there might not be a Constitution of a United States to mend. The rail splitter was no hair splitter. But such infractions were not in general sweeping. Congress, as is often true in times of crisis, generally accepted or confirmed the president's questionable acts. Lincoln, though accused of being a simple Susan tyrant, did not believe that his iron-handed authority would continue once the Union was preserved. As he pointedly remarked in 1863, a man suffering from temporary illness would not persist in feeding on bitter medicines for the remainder of his healthful life. Congress was not in session when the war erupted, so Lincoln gathered the reins into his own hands. Brushing aside legal objections, he boldly proclaimed a blockade. His action was later upheld by the Supreme Court. He arbitrarily increased the size of the federal army, something that only Congress can do under the Constitution. Congress later approved. He had directed the Secretary of the Treasury to advance $2 million without appropriation or security to 3 private citizens for military purposes, a grave irregularity contrary to the Constitution. He suspended the precious privilege of the writ of habeas corpus so that anti-unionists might be summarily arrested. In taking this step, he defied a dubious ruling by the Chief Justice that the safeguards of habeas corpus could be set aside only by the authorization of Congress. Lincoln's regime was guilty of many other high-handed acts. For example, it arranged for supervised voting in the border states. There, the intimidated citizen holding a colored ballot indicating his party preference had to march between 2 lines of armed troops. The federal officials also ordered the suspension of certain newspapers and the arrest of their editors on grounds of obstructing the war. Jefferson Davis was less able than Lincoln to exercise arbitrary power, mainly because of confirmed states' riders who fanned an intense spirit of localism. To the very end of the conflict, the owners of horse-drawn vans in Petersburg, Virginia, prevented the sensible joining of the incoming and outgoing tracks of a militarily vital railroad. The South seemed willing to lose the war before it would surrender local rights, and it did. Excuse me. A few more pages. Volunteers and draftees, North and South. Ravenous, the gods of war demanded men, lots of men. Northern armies were at first manned solely by volunteers, with each state assigned a quota based on population. But in 1863, after volunteering had slackened, Congress passed a federal conscription law for the first time on a nationwide scale in the United States. The provisions were grossly unfair to the poor. Rich boys, including young John D. Rockefeller, could hire substitutes to go in their places or purchase exemption outright by paying $300. $300 men was the scornful epithet applied to these slackers. Draftees who did not have the necessary cash complained that their bandit-like government demanded $300 or your life. The draft was especially damned in the Democratic strongholds of the North, notably in New York City. A frightful riot broke out in 1863, touched off largely by underprivileged and anti-black Irish Americans, who shouted, "Down with Lincoln!" and "Down with the draft!" For several days, the New York draft riots put the city at the mercy of a rampaging, pillaging mob. Scores of lives were lost, and the victims included many lynched blacks. Elsewhere in the North, conscription met with resentment and an occasional minor riot. More than 90% of the Union troops were volunteers because social and patriotic pressures to enlist were strong. As able-bodied men became scarcer, generous bounties for enlistment were offered by federal, state, and local authorities, and an enterprising and money-wise volunteer might legitimately pocket more than $1,000. With money flowing so freely, an unsavory crew of bounty brokers and substitute brokers sprang up at home and abroad. They combed and They combed the poorhouses of the British Isles and Western Europe, and many an Irishman or German was befuddled with whiskey and induced to enlist. A number of the slippery bounty boys deserted, volunteered elsewhere, and netted other handsome haul. The records reveal that one bounty jumper repeated his profitable operation 32 times, but desertion was by no means confined to bounty jumpers. The rolls of the Union Army recorded about 200,000 deserters of all classes, and the Confederate authorities were plagued with a runaway problem of similar dimensions. Like the North, the South at first relied mainly on volunteers, but since the Confederacy was much less populous, it scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel much more quickly. Quipsters observed that any man who could see lightning and hear thunder was judged fit for service. The Richmond regime, robbing both cradle and grave, ages 17 to 50, was forced to resort to conscription as early as April 1862, nearly a year earlier than the Union. Confederate draft regulations also worked serious injustices. As in the North, a rich man could hire a substitute or purchase exemption. Slave owners or overseers with 20 slaves might also claim exception. These special privileges, later modified, made for bad feelings among the less prosperous, many of whom complained that this was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Why sacrifice one's life to save an affluent neighbor's slaves? No large-scale draft riots broke out in the South as in New York City, but the Confederate conscription agents often found it prudent to avoid those areas inhabited by sharp-shooting mountain whites, who were branded Tories, traitors, and Yankee lovers. The economic stresses of war. Blessed with a lion's share of the wealth, the North rode through the financial breakers much more smoothly than the South. Excise taxes on tobacco and alcohol were substantially increased by Congress. An income tax was levied for the first time in the nation's experience, and although the rates were painlessly low by later standards, they netted millions of dollars. Customs receipts likewise proved to be important revenue raisers. Early in 1861, after enough anti-protection Southern members had seceded, Congress passed the Morrill Tariff Act, superseding the low tariff of 1857. It increased the existing duties some 5 to 10%, boosting them to about the moderate level of the Walker Tariff of 1846. But these modest rates were soon pushed sharply upward by the necessities of war. The increases were designed partly to raise additional revenue and partly to provide more protection for the prosperous manufacturers who were being plucked by the new internal taxes. A protective tariff thus became identified with the Republican Party, as American industrialists, mostly Republicans, waxed fat on these welcome benefits. The Washington Treasury also issued greenbacked paper money, totaling nearly $450 million at face value. This printing press currency was inadequately supported by gold, and hence its value was determined by the nation's credit. Greenbacks thus fluctuated with the fortunes of Union arms that at one low point were worth only 39 cents on the gold dollar. The holders of the notes, victims of creeping inflation, were indirectly taxed as the value of the currency slowly withered in their hands. Yet borrowing far outstripped both greenbacks and taxes as a money raiser. The Federal Treasury netted $2 billion to the sale of bonds, which bore interest and which were payable at a later date. The moderate technique of selling these issues to the people directly through drives and payroll deductions had not yet been devised. Accordingly, the Treasury was forced to market its bonds through the private banking house of J. Cook and Company, which received a commission of 3/8% on all sales. With both profits and patriotism at stake, the bankers succeeded in making effective appeals to the citizen purchasers. A financial landmark of the war was the national banking system, authorized by Congress in 1863. Launched partly as a stimulant to the sale of government bonds, it was also designed to establish a standard banknote currency. The country was then flooded with depreciated rag money issued by unreliable bankers. Banks that joined the national banking system could buy government bonds and issue sound paper money backed by them. The war-born National Banking Act thus turned out to be the first significant step taken toward a unified banking network since 1836, when the monster bank of the United States was killed by Andrew Jackson. Spawned by the war, this new system continued to function for 50 years until replaced by the Federal Reserve System in 1913. An impoverished South was beset by different financial woes. Customs duties were choked off as the coils of the Union blockade tightened. Large issues of Confederate bonds were sold at home and abroad, amounting to nearly $400 million. The Richmond regime also increased taxes sharply and imposed a 10% levy on farm produce. But in general to the states' rights, Southerners were immovably opposed to heavy direct taxation by the central authority. Only about 1% of the total income was raised in this way. As revenue began to dry up, the Confederate government was forced to print blue-backed paper money with complete abandon. Runaway inflation occurred as Southern presses continued to grind out the poorly backed Treasury notes, totaling in all more than $1 billion. The Confederate paper dollar finally sank to the point where it was only worth 1.6 cents when Lee surrendered. Overall, the war inflicted a 9,000% inflation rate on the Confederacy, contrasted with the 80% for the Union. Sorry, I'm clearing my throat. It's a long chapter, but we're almost, it's only a few more headings. The North's economic boom. Wartime prosperity in the North was little short of miraculous. The marvel is that a divided nation could fight a costly conflict for 4 long years and then emerge seemingly more prosperous than ever before. New factories, sheltered by the friendly umbrella of the new protective tariffs, mushroomed forth. Soaring prices, resulting from inflation, unfortunately pinched the day laborer and the white-collar worker to some extent, but the manufacturers and business people raked in the fortunes of war. The Civil War bred a millionaire class for the first time in American history. Though a few individuals of extreme wealth could have been found earlier, many of these newly rich were noisy, gaudy, brassy, and given to extravagant living. Their emergence merely illustrates the truth that some gluttony and greed always marred the devotion and self-sacrifice called forth by war. The story of speculators and peculators was roughly the same in both camps, but graft was more flagrant in the North than in the South, partly because there was more to steal. Yankee sharpness appeared at its worst. Dishonest agents, putting profits above patriotism, palmed off aged and blind horses on government purchasers. Unscrupulous northern manufacturers supplied shoes with cardboard soles and fast disintegrating uniforms of reprocessed or shoddy wool rather than virgin wool. Hence, the reproachful term "shoddy millionaires" was doubly fair. Excuse me. One profiteer reluctantly admitted that his profits were painfully large. Newly invented labor-saving machinery enabled the North to expand economically, even though the cream of its manpower was being drained off to the fighting front. The sewing machine wrought wonders in fabricating uniforms and military footwear. The marriage of a military need and innovative machinery largely ended the production of custom-tailored clothing. Graduated standard measurements were introduced, creating sizes that were widely used in the civilian garment industry forever after. Clattering mechanical reapers, which numbered about 250,000 by 1865, proved hardly less potent than thundering guns. They not only released tens of thousands of farm boys for the army, but fed them their field rations. They produced vast surpluses of grain that, when sent abroad, helped to dethrone King Cotton. They proved profits with which the North was able to buy munitions and supplies from abroad. They contributed to the feverish prosperity of the North, a prosperity that enabled the Union to weather the war with flying colors. Other industries were humming. The discovery of petroleum gushers in 1859 had led to a rush of 59ers to Pennsylvania. The result was the birth of a new industry with its petroleum plutocracy and coal oil Johnnies. Pioneers continued to push westward during the war, altogether an estimated 300,000 people. Major magnets were free gold nuggets and free land under the Homestead Act of 1862. Strong propellants were the federal draft agents. The only major northern industry to suffer a crippling setback was the ocean-carrying trade, which fell prey to the Alabama and other raiders. The Civil War was a women's war, too. The protracted conflict opened new opportunities for women. When men departed in uniform, women often took their jobs. In Washington, D.C., 500 women clerks, government girls, became government workers, with over 100 in the Treasury Department alone. The booming military demand for shoes and clothing, combined with technological marvels like the sewing machine, likewise drew countless women into industrial employment. Before the war, 1 industrial worker in 4 had been female. During the war, the ratio rose to 1 in 3. Other women on both sides stepped up to the fighting front, or close behind it. More than 400 women accompanied husbands and sweethearts into battle by posing as male soldiers. Other women took on dangerous spy missions. One woman was executed for smuggling gold to the Confederacy. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, America's first female physician, helped organize the U.S. Sanitary Commission to assist the Union armies in the field. The commission trained nurses, collected medical supplies, and equipped hospitals. Commission work helped many women to acquire the organizational skills and the self-confidence that would propel the women's movement forward after the war. Heroically energetic Clara Barton and dedicated Dorothy Dix, superintendent of nurses for the Union Army, helped transform nursing from a lowly service into a respected profession, and in the process opened up another major sphere of employment for women in the post-war era. Equally renowned in the South was Sally Tompkins, who ran a Richmond infirmary for wounded Confederate soldiers and was awarded the rank of captain by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Still, other women, North as well as South, organized bazaars and fairs that raised millions of dollars for the relief of widows, orphans, and disabled soldiers. A crushed cotton kingdom. The South fought to the point of exhaustion. The suffocation caused by blockade, together with the destruction wrought by invaders, took a terrible toll. Possessing 30% of the national wealth in 1860, the South claimed only 12% in 1870. Before the war, the average per capita income of Southerners, including slaves, was about 2/3 of that of the Northerners. The Civil War squeezed the average Southern income to 2/5 of the Northern level, where it remained for the rest of the century. The South's bid for independence exacted a cruel and devastating cost. Transportation collapsed. The South was even driven to economic cannibalism of pulling up rails from the less used lines to repair the main ones. Widow weights were melted down into bullets. Gourds replaced dishes. Pins became so scarce that they were loaned with reluctance. To the brutal end, the South mustered remarkable resourcefulness and spirit. Women buoyed their menfolk, many of whom had seen enough of the war at first hand to be heartily sick of it. A proposal was made by a number of women that they cut off their long hair and sell it abroad, but the project was not adopted, partly because of the blockade. The self-sacrificing women took pride in denying themselves the silks and satins of their northern sisters. The chorus of a song, The Southern Girl, touched a tearful note. So hurrah, hurrah, for Southern rights, hurrah, hurrah for the homespun dress the Southern ladies wear. At war's end, the Northern captains of industry had conquered the Southern lords of the manor. A crippled South left the capitalistic North free to work its own way, with high tariffs and other benefits. The manufacturing moguls of the North, ushering in the full-fledged industrial revolution, were headed for increased dominance over over American economic and political life. Hitherto, the agrarian slavocracy of the South had partially checked the ambitions of the rising plutocracy of the North. Now, cotton capitalism had lost out to the industrial capitalism. The South of 1865 was to be rich in little but amputees, wars, war heroes, ruins, and memories. Whew! 'Tis over. So that was chapter 20. I need to take a sip of... Wow, that took 40 minutes. Holy crap. Well, it's over. Yay!